And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
As always, thanks for tuning into the podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of TeachThought PD. Okay, a couple logistics and housekeeping items. As I mentioned in the last episode, we have pre-registration open for next summer's Grow 20 event. But now we actually also have another event that I'm excited to announce. We will be having an open registration Foundations of PBL workshop in Hilton Head this spring. The dates for that will be March 16th through 18th. We'll have Monday, Tuesday, and be done at 11:30 on the Wednesday. So if you are looking for a place to get away from winter weather, perhaps, and relax, we will be at a resort on Hilton Head Island, the Beach House, a Holiday Inn resort, and we will get to work, and hopefully in the evenings the weather will be good and you can sit by the beach and take a walk on the beach and connect with educators from around the world and build your capacity and understanding of project-based learning. So if you want more information on that, I encourage you to go to wegrowteachers.com/PBLHH. You can also look under the events tab. And as I mentioned, Grow 20 pre-registration is open. We'll probably open regular registration in January or so, and that will be in June of 2020, our 4th annual PBL Grow event. As always, I encourage you to share and tell others about the podcast and our work and any blogs or content that we have. We appreciate it. And as usual, we hope it's helpful. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Megan Gafford, who is an artist and a professor at the University of Colorado, Denver. We talked about and centered our conversation around an article in Quillette.com, Quillette Online Magazine, and the title of that article is called Experiments in Nurturing Classroom Curiosity. My apologies up front. I did experience some technical difficulties, so I think right around 10 minutes in, I lost Megan, but hopefully it doesn't sound too terrible, and you can make sense of that transition as we restarted. We touched on lots of things, really just focusing on the element of inquiry and curiosity. Started by giving a little bit of background on how she made a shift from not really including politics in her art, and her shift from being very fundamentalist Christian to an atheist, and then how she established and created a foundation for a safe space for inquiry, not as safe space for trigger words and violence as speech or speech as violence. And how she did that through Daniel Dennett's rules and steel manning and things like that. Went on to talk about tame and wicked problems and some of the things that have influenced her in the mindset and her teaching style. So, interesting conversation about pedagogy with an instructor who was not classically or technically trained in pedagogy, as most teachers are, at least in the K-12 realm. Certainly something that I believe we need to have more of in our classrooms and our schools around the country and around the world. So I hope you find it helpful. Megan, welcome to the podcast. I'm happy to have you on, and I'm going to give you the opportunity, as I usually like to do, to introduce yourself so that folks have a better sense of who you are and why we might be talking about the things that we're going to talk about.
So I'm a visual artist. My background is in painting and drawing, although I've expanded to use scientific materials in my art practice. Specifically, more unsettling scientific materials like radiation and cybernetics, because I like to create experiences where viewers are attracted to the beauty I find in those materials and present to them, but then also feel repulsed by the unsettling side, and it creates a complicated viewing experience. So because my background is in painting and drawing, though, that is what I mostly teach. I'm an adjunct professor in the Denver-Boulder area, teaching at a handful of universities, mostly teaching technical skills with painting and drawing. And you reached out to me after I wrote an article about the first upper-level discussion class I taught, where students were making work about socially engaged art.
Right. The piece in Quillette is what you're referring to, and I did reach out because the title, if nothing else, grabbed my attention because listeners and folks who are familiar with our work know curiosity and inquiry is a real cornerstone of what we do here. So the piece was published October 24th, 2019 in Quillette, quillette.com, and you can search for it. We'll link in the show notes, but it's called Experiments in Nurturing Classroom Curiosity. So there's some things that maybe will help us, I think, talk about some of the things we're going to talk about and the experience that you had. And I think one of those things is one of the first things you mention in the article, which is a lecture that you gave at the University of New Orleans, which is why when we were first talking before we went live, I was thinking you were in New Orleans. But the piece that the lecture that I'm referring to is called Against Political Art, and there's a video and it's linked to that. But I guess give us the broad strokes or a summary of what you were meaning by that.
Well, I opened that lecture with an anecdote, and I also mentioned this anecdote to my students that when I was a student, I was making political art. I think that it feels meaningful to try to use your artwork to make the world a better place. And the most straightforward way to approach that when you're a student is to make something political. But, and the kind of political work I was making was about abortion, a very contentious topic. And I came to realize that I was either preaching to the choir or pissing people off. And that wasn't helping my cause. It was, if anything, only crippling it in whatever small impact that I had. So I came to lose faith in political art, as I put it in that lecture. And this is in my own personal journey where I came to embrace inquiry and curiosity, where I realized that if we want to do a better job grappling with social issues, then we have to do a better job just understanding the truth of them in the first place. And I think that curiosity is a passion that motivates you to learn the truth, even if it's an ugly truth, if it's a truth that you're reluctant to embrace, because it's the passion that specifically is the yearning to understand, and it can compete with other passions, the passion to feel right, to the passion of pride. So in that lecture, I open with that anecdote, and then I launch into a bit of art history, and I compare political artists with artists who I think do a better job of just capturing their viewers' imagination and giving them an incredible aesthetic experience, and experiences that you can still read into and find deep meaning, either an existential meaning. A lot of them had to do with mortality, the experience that we all inevitably share, and also political meanings, but they don't tell you what to think, which I think is the big problem with political art, is it tells you what to think. And I prefer art that just encourages you to get thinking in the first place.
Mm-hmm. So, correct me if I'm wrong, you stated in that lecture, if I'm understanding it correctly, that you have gone through some fairly seismic shifts in what you think is right and what is wrong in some of the major pieces of what people believe in, like religion, for example, right?
Correct. I wrote another essay titled "Curiosity is Sacred," and I mean that quite literally. At least for me, I had been a fundamentalist fundamentalist Christian when I was a teenager. And when I got to college, I went to college at the University of New Orleans, where I was invited back to lecture. I took a class about the Bible as literature, and it was my first time studying it, not as Bible study, which I had done many times, but as a book written by people. And the professor was Catholic. She was not an atheist, but she was very open about contradictions, the different accounts in the Bible that I hadn't picked up on before, no matter how many times I read it in Bible study. And because I had a very fundamentalist worldview, it was all or nothing. So once one domino fell, it pretty quickly knocked down the rest, because I felt that if it wasn't all true, how could you know any of it was true? And the professor was, she felt a bit guilty that I ended up losing my faith in her class, and she was really kind when I sent her lots of soul-searching emails. So she was a really wonderful professor. Her name's Lisa Werner. If anyone goes to the University of New Orleans, I highly recommend taking classes with her.
She'll change your life, literally.
She will. She's a great example of a professor who was very encouraging, even though I was going through a transformation where she didn't agree with the outcome. Again, she wasn't an atheist. So I compare this losing of faith to the similar, although less severe, loss of faith I had in political art. And I think that this experience of realizing how painfully wrong I was very character building. And it helped me realize that no matter how certain I am, who knows what I'm going to turn a corner and find out and realize how wrong I am all over again. It's made me wary of overconfidence.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting trait to have, and I think, unfortunately, not a characteristic that enough people in this world have. It's often seeming more and more like people are doing everything they can to be right and to prove they're right and not be wrong, that confirmation bias, desirability bias kind of thing. And our media and social media is playing and preying on that in massive ways, I would say. But the idea that we want to be understood and we want to understand, and even so far as we want to try to figure out where in fact we are wrong and approach it like that, as opposed to try to figure out where everybody else is wrong. And there's some overlap there, but is there any particular reason you would attribute to having that kind of a mindset? Because I do think that that's somewhat unusual, and perhaps especially unusual with somebody who was raised as a fundamentalist Christian.
Well, I wasn't raised as one from childhood, which might have had something to do with it. I was a military brat, and there are youth groups on the Army posts. So I was living overseas. Wasn't around much family because we were overseas. I was a child of divorce, so the youth leaders were kind of like supplemental parents. And I didn't have a terrible experience as a Christian. It was not a judgmental situation. So it was a part of my life that lasted for about 6 or 7 years. It wasn't something that was ingrained from childhood. I don't know if, because I don't know for sure if that made a difference, but maybe it did. And I don't know how easy or difficult it is, like what the percentage of people are who would have a kind of cataclysmic change in the way that they view the world. But you mentioned the urge to prove other people wrong. And I think that's actually very important. The Karl Popper idea of falsifiability, that we make progress through proving ideas wrong, is mostly effective when other people are trying to prove someone else's ideas wrong. So in a sense, some of the competitiveness and desire to be right can work in class.
I was asking about the dispositions that kind of the character traits that led you, or I guess in your upbringing, that led you to have those dispositions and character traits that where you questioned yourself and you were trying to not be wrong. So apologies to folks who are listening that we missed maybe the last part of that conversation. So anyways, and maybe you can recall some of those pieces as you answer this this question, which is, what led you to write the article for Quillette?
So I can recap a little bit for the last question and kind of hit the key point, and also the way you reframed the question made me think of something else. The main point I was trying to make is that I don't know how many people end up having a huge shift in the way they view the world, but that I think discovering the truth is an emergent quality of curiosity that occurs when people are competitively trying to prove each other wrong. And out of that competition, which might not seem like the most heartwarming way to go about finding truth, maybe a more bloodthirsty way of going about it, that the truth can emerge. And I was describing that as Karl Popper's idea of falsifiability, of proving ideas wrong. And you asked about character traits. So I got to thinking it's worth mentioning that I don't know if this has to do with upbringing or just some kind of innate personality characteristic, but curiosity is an aspect of openness to experience, one of the big 5 personality traits in psychology. So if that model of the mind is correct, then it may be that, since I do think of curiosity as a passion, that it's one that some people just have more of, the way that some people can have a hotter temper. So there might just be some distribution across the population of people who are naturally more curious. I wrote another essay as a follow-up to the Curiosity is Sacred essay I wrote, wondering what if I'm wrong, and I actually point that out as a problem with sacralizing curiosity, of making it something that is so valuable that if somebody isn't curious, they might be shamed. And it would not be correct, I think, to shame somebody for not having a naturally curious disposition. It's not the only value that I think is sacred. And then to your next question about why I wrote the Quillette essay, I actually reached out to Quillette before or right around the time I began teaching the class. And I was aware of campus controversies and people being deplatformed and canceled. So when I was asked to teach the class, I was determined to teach it in a way that felt honest to me. So kind of in line with the Against Political Art talk I gave, I didn't want to pressure students to make political art, but I also didn't want to stop them from doing that if they wanted to. I just wanted to have a class where we could all talk openly about the social issues that they cared about. But I knew that the open discussion could be tricky in university climates. So once the class was underway, at the very beginning of class, they asked the students what their interests were, and it came out that they really spanned the entire political spectrum, which was exciting. There was a student who was against abortion even for rape victims. There was a student who was very skeptical of democracy, who was a neo-Marxist. There was an Army veteran who wanted more border control, and a lot of students making work about being gay or biracial. So once I got to thinking, okay, this could become a powder keg. Like, I went into it not knowing if it would be an echo chamber or a powder keg, but once I heard the reviews, I thought it could be definitely a powder keg. I sent a pitch to Quillette, figuring that if there's a worst case scenario and it becomes one of those crazy cancel situations that you read about in Quillette and elsewhere, like, well, I'll at least make a good essay out of the situation. But hopefully it won't be. And I was really delighted that it was a more optimistic essay. And because I was hoping that I could pull off doing it right, and kind of like how when I was making political art, I didn't like the idea of either pissing people off or preaching to the choir, but to find the dialogue between those extremes. I really wanted to find that within my classroom. So I'm very glad that the essay turned out to be one with a happy ending. But it was also kind of a safeguard for me professionally. It's like, well, if this tanks my teaching career, at least maybe it can help my writing career.
Well, that's an optimistic way to go about that.
Well, it's easier to do something that's a little bit scary if you put yourself in a position where you don't feel like you have much to lose. So if you feel like it's a win-win situation, then you don't have to be too timid.
Right, right. So your anticipation, or maybe worst case scenario insofar as the success of this class, is that it would be a powder keg, and that's mostly I'm taking based on at least the perception, and there have been lots of reports and stories, like you said, in Quillette and other places, and some of the people that I've talked with on the podcast as well. And it is really hard to figure out the magnitude of this problem, whether or not, how much of this sort of cancel culture outrage stuff is going on our college campuses. And honestly, at the K-12, certainly more at the 12 than the K spectrum of public education or even private education, but there are certainly fairly well documented cases of people in our universities not being tolerant of ideas and questions and being asked questions, and even so far as the idea that being questioned or someone being critical of their views is tantamount to some sort of ism, feminism, racism, or Islamophobia, or something like that. So that was not your experience here?
Well, I had the same confusion that you just described, where I didn't know exactly how widespread the problem was. I thought maybe it was more isolated to the coasts, and that very well could have been something that helped, being in Denver, not being in the political hotbeds of Portland or New York. I did have one student who very, very much disliked me, and but that student, she explicitly said when the topic of censorship came up in the class that she was not for censorship. So there didn't seem to be anyone in my classroom who was predisposed to outright canceling somebody. And I hope I get the chance to teach this class again to expand my sample size. I don't know if I was just very lucky to get a class that was both very interesting with a wide range of viewpoints, and at the same time didn't have anyone who was too trigger happy with canceling. This student did accused me of providing a platform for bigotry at the end of the semester, most specifically because of the student who was pro-life even for rape victims. That was the opinion that ruffled the most feathers in the classroom. So I imagine what she meant, since she also said she was against censorship, was that she felt like I could have structured the class just to make it less likely for someone to voice those opinions in the first place rather than outright censoring them. She mentioned that the readings I assigned facilitated the problematic discussions. So I think that maybe you could think of that as a sort of softer form of censorship, or just kind of like, well, you can say that, but you shouldn't, in stronger terms. But again, she never tried to shut anyone down. She was never trying to make any of her classmates. She never tried to speak over anyone or make them shut up. So I might have just been lucky, but I do think that both the emphasis on probing questions and criticizing with kindness made a big difference. One of my students who read my Quillette essay, the Undemocratic Socialist, he emailed me after reading it and said that he thought that the emphasis on kindness, on criticizing with kindness, made the biggest difference, that he felt that everybody could speak up without the risk of being belittled. So I suppose, along with curiosity, that was the major ingredient.
Right. And so the pieces there, which are actually, what's interesting is that there is a creation, as you described it, of a sort of safe space, which, as of right now, safe spaces have been stigmatized to not be triggering anybody, and words as violence, and I think you mentioned that in the article as well, but that you went through some very specific steps and talk about Daniel Dennett's, what is it, the rules for engagement or something like that, and really making sure that there was a foundation laid for those conversations to be handled in a way, or to be had in a way that respected even those people who, especially this one student that you're mentioning, right?
Right. So Daniel Dennett's 4 rules for arguing start with the idea of steel manning. So the first rule is to present your opponent's views so clearly that they would thank you for putting it that way, which is the opposite of a straw man argument, where you throw up a false version of somebody's argument that's easier to tear down. So instead of straw manning, you steel man it. And I really emphasize that first step more than the others, but the others are important too. The next one is to state any points of agreement, especially if they're not common points of agreement with your opponent. And then to say anything you learned from your opponent and thank them for teaching you something you didn't know. And then, and only then, rule 4 is that you can offer a rebuttal. So I wanted the students to try to reframe arguments they disagreed with, which I would ask them to do in discussions throughout the semester. And I tried to model that behavior myself. So when students were describing their interests at the beginning of class, I offered to steel man them for them, particularly the student who was pro-life, because I used myself as an example, and I talked about how I was making pro-choice artwork as a college student, and then I realized it wasn't working, and I shared that with the students to let them know that I understood the urge to make political art as well as the reasons not to. And I wanted them to feel like they had the opportunity to go in whichever direction they wanted to. I wasn't going to pigeonhole them to either be or not to be a political artist. So even though I was trying not to push my opinions on the class here, I'd already outed a contentious political opinion, and the student knew that. So I thought it was particularly important that right away I steel man her argument. And she was very happy with the way I put it for her, and I think that helped build trust. I think the goal of steel manning is to build trust so that your opponent knows you're not just out to undermine them. Mm-hmm. And then on the other end of the spectrum, the undemocratic socialist was a very engaging student, and he was sharing his views, and after a while he asked me what my views were, so then I felt comfortable sharing more opinions. And with him too, he was self-conscious about his ability to express them. He would often say, like, I don't know if I'm expressing this well. So I would use steel manning as a way to help him articulate what he meant and to help him find the words he was struggling to get. Mm-hmm. So I found it to be a very useful teaching technique, again, because if you're going to be honest about your opinions with your students, you have to make sure they can still trust you if they know that there's a disagreement. And also, if the students are having a hard time just articulating themselves, it can give them a leg up.
Right. It's interesting that you mentioned the steel manning piece, and it's connected to the environment that you had, and like you said, it could have been just a unique makeup. You never know. I was listening to a podcast yesterday with Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter on Blogging Heads TV. I love listening to those guys talk. I don't know if you ever had a chance to listen to them,
yeah,
but
familiar.
Yeah, and I've had Glenn on the podcast, and I really appreciate his ability to constantly steel man and present the other side. And I think that is super important. But as they were talking about having conversations in class, I'm trying to remember what the topic was, and it's not particularly relevant what the topic was, but what he mentioned, Glenn did, is that he, in one of his economics classes at Brown, was trying to sort of elicit and solicit differing opinions on a fairly polarizing topic, and he absolutely could not get any takers, even though he said, I know some of those folks in there agreed with me and some disagreed with me because they have said so in person. So that they were taking as at least some evidence that there is not and maybe Brown is a more, like you said, coastal, more liberal setting than there in Denver. It could be lots of things contributing to that, but it was really interesting to hear those two different experiences that you explained and what he explained. So I'm wondering, when you think about the way that you're talking about teaching and the avoidance or your stance on political art, how do you think about teaching as a political act? Because there are people who are staunchly advocating for teaching as a political act.
I suppose that would depend on what they mean by political acts, but in the way I interpret it, I do not think of teaching as a political act. I think that your goal is just to help the students become better at thinking, and obviously you want to give them correct information. You don't want people walking away with crazy conspiracy theories. And so that there's some extent of saying, well, actually, no, that's just not true. Being in the arts, I'm in such a subjective field. It's not, it's not like biology where you could
although some people say that's a bit subjective these days.
Right. And I have to say, I don't think biology is very subjective. So I think that a biology professor would really be navigating a different situation. And, when I have students talking about their political views, I'm not an expert in things like immigration.
Right.
And so all I can do is just help them be as articulate and thoughtful and well-researched as possible. And I'm just not in a position the way an economics or a biology or other kinds of professors are, where you're presenting super hard facts. It's different if I'm teaching technical skills. There's a right and a wrong way to do certain things, but those certainly aren't political issues. But anyway, I do not think of teaching as a political act. I think that it is service more than activism. You're there to serve the students and just help them be better thinkers. And something else I was thinking of when you mentioned the contrast between these two different classrooms, I perhaps fortunately got sick at the beginning of that semester when I was teaching the political art class. So we had the first day of class, and then I got sick. So I used the online platform that the university has to create a discussion group, and we had class remotely. So I had the students write out and share with their classmates on a forum what their ideas were for making art with the class. And then I required them to respond to their classmates. And in retrospect, I think it was really fortunate that happened, because the students who are more introverted or more likely to self-censor felt, I think, more emboldened. So, for example, the student who was pro-life, she was very shy about speaking in front of people. And she certainly didn't want to self-censor because she was very open about her views. And I don't even think it was necessarily her being nervous about sharing contentious views. I think she was just nervous about public speaking in general. And on the one hand, I think it's important to help students become better public speakers. But on the other hand, next time I get an opportunity to teach a class like this, I do plan on integrating a online forum with the students more, and to use that more throughout the semester, hoping that the students who are going to get to be too shy to speak up in a group discussion will be more likely to say something on the forum. And I think it's also easier to track participation, because you can say, okay, you have to make one post a week, or you respond to 2 classmates a week throughout the semester, and they know they've got this requirement, and it'll force them to search to say something, and it gives them time to be thoughtful about what they're going to say. So I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten sick, if I hadn't had that written component to the discussion. But I think that might have been a big help. So I suppose catering to different personalities and different levels of extroversion might make a difference.
Yeah. Well, one of the things as I think about teaching about that question about teaching as a political act, I would say that it is, and maybe not political, but it's so important for our democratic citizens to be thoughtful and ask great questions. So insofar as we're helping our students learn how to ask great questions, I suppose in some way that's a political act in furthering democracy. But the idea that we're teaching kids how to what to think instead of how to think is where I think we get into trouble, and that to me is where the inquiry comes in, right? So really leaning heavily into being able to ask the right questions, and whether it's art or science or whatever, not necessarily that knowledge is the intended outcome. It's certainly a byproduct of a great education, but that we know what questions are important to ask in this field of art or in that field of science or that kind of thing. So what we have to engage them in, it seems, is just this constant, subjecting them to constant questioning and asking them to ask great questions. And that just seems like it's missing from so many classrooms. I don't know what your experience might have been as a student.
Well, a couple thoughts. I agree with the way you framed it. I think I resist calling that political at all, like teaching people how to ask the right questions.
Yeah.
As you pointed out, certainly does help them become better citizens.
Yeah, it's not a great fit.
I think people have tried to expand the term political to cover just about everything. You'll hear people say, everything is political. It's sort of an outgrowth of the second wave feminist idea that the personal is political. And I've gotten in conversations with friends who take that view. It's like, well, you can't deny that everything's political. And I think that just waters down the word to the point that it's meaningless. So I would resist labeling that as political. I think it has political applications. As you point out, it does make you a better citizen. But it's not inherently political to learn how to be a good question asker. And I think that the best way to get people to become good at asking questions is to help them discover how enjoyable it is to, like, the pleasure of finding things out. Mm-hmm. And a lot of science popularizers like Neil deGrasse Tyson will talk about how you really have to capture their imaginations when they're young. And I hope that's not true. I hope that even high school students, college students, adults can still discover this thrill of understanding something. And I think it goes hand in hand with frustration. It's something that I've learned about more intimately since I've started branching out beyond painting and drawing and using scientific materials as artwork, as art materials, because I don't have a background in science. I often get myself in over my head, and I'm trying to make some kind of technology work, and it takes months. It is very frustrating. And I came to realize that if solving so this is the difference between a tame and wicked problem. A tame problem is like a hardware problem where you're just trying to get something to work. There's a technological right and wrong answer. And the label tame can seem misleading because it doesn't mean it's easy. So, putting a man on the moon wasn't easy, but that was a tame problem. And a wicked problem is one where people can't even agree on how to define the problem in the first place. And that's a lot of our socio-political problems. So I think maybe if we just have kids doing more difficult science fair projects where they realize that if a tame problem can be this hard, if solving this technical problem is this daunting, then who am I to think it's easy to solve a wicked problem? So to me, that has been a crucial part of my education, and it's something that I learned more as an adult when in graduate school I started using these scientific materials as artwork. So I don't know how to put everyone in that position to give them that shock to the system where they realize that tame problems are so painful, that wicked problems can't be dismissed as something that there's an easy solution for. I don't know, maybe even if folks just try to do their own car maintenance for a while, they'll realize that compared to the difficulty of tame problems, wicked problems are just mind-boggling.
Yeah, well, I've not heard those labels on it. That's a really interesting way to think about it. And I suppose one of the things is I'm kind of thinking through or looking through your article here, and you mentioned philosopher Sir Roger, is it Scruton? Scruton? Yeah. Mm-hmm. How incuriosity affects the extreme ends of the political spectrum when he stated that the absence of curiosity is a permanent characteristic of the revolutionary consciousness. And then you go on to say, ideology compels belief in brittle answers. Curiosity urges us to wander into the unknown. And I suppose that squares really, I would think at least, squares really well with the shift that you had from fundamentalist Christian to more atheist position, where it's not something that you don't know the answer. You don't know what this all means. You don't know if there is a God or a not God or 10 gods or whatever, and perhaps being okay with that ambiguity. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yes. That if I were to be very specific about it, I'm an agnostic atheist, an atheist in the sense that I do not have a God, agnostic in the sense that I think it's not a question you can really know the answer to, but without enough proof for one, then I just don't know, and I'm comfortable with that. Right.
And so that is something that I think, as you're kind of talking about the science of things, and that we don't want to not continue to try to find out answers, but recognize that we are okay without knowing all the answers. And I think that sort of the opposite position, if there is one, is that I want to be really comfortable knowing that at least somebody is providing me an answer, and that makes me feel more safe, I guess, or something of that. I suppose religion serves that purpose, ideologies, dogma, all of those kinds of positions where people just absolutely seem intent on repelling anything that's contrary because it's really uncomfortable.
Right, and I think that becomes dangerous when somebody refuses to allow somebody else to doubt because it makes them too uncomfortable to have that belief questioned that's too precious. So I think that this was the big problem with the totalitarian ideologies and with more fundamentalist strains of religion, when people are so certain, and what I described it as brittle because it's a certainty that can't bend, it can't be flexible. So if somebody is inflexibly certain, then they have every incentive to prevent anyone from trying to bend their belief, because something that's brittle will break if you bend it, and that's a really big risk. I think my own fundamental beliefs were brittle, which is why they came toppling down. They were very strong. I was very passionate for, like I said, about 6 or 7 years, but once that chink in the armor happened, it all came tumbling down pretty quick. So that brittleness gives people a lot to lose.
Yeah. And so you think you sort of acquired this curiosity mindset, or at least the skills of that you employed in your teaching in graduate school through the science as you sort of applied it to art?
Yes, I think that when I lost faith in God, I needed to replace it with something else. I think that we are a religious species, and that religious impulse doesn't have to be met with traditional religions, but you kind of have to make something sacred. So my sort of gateway drug into the scientific worldview was Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. Mm-hmm. And I fell in love with science as a way of understanding truth. So it very much was, curiosity very much became a replacement for God for me. And even with science, at first I had this kind of innocent wonder about it. And then when I first started using scientific materials, I got interested in a particle detector because it's the closest you can get to seeing the subatomic world. So again, just this innocent sense of wonder. I just wanted to see something that's supposed to be invisible. And you can make a particle detector on your own, which sounds crazy. It doesn't sound like the kind of thing anyone ought to just be able to do.
Seems like a wicked thing.
Not a wicked thing, but it just sounds really hard. It's still a tame problem, but it just sounds crazy. Be like, oh yeah, I can just go out in my garage and make a subatomic particle detector. Mm-hmm. Sounds too fancy.
Right.
So, but you can make one. It's called a cloud chamber, and you create a temperature difference. So you can use dry ice to make the bottom of the glass chamber very cold, and the top is room temperature. And you can put isopropyl alcohol in it and create a cloud, just like the clouds up in the atmosphere, how the water vapor in the air goes through this intense temperature change. And then the water vapor supersaturates to become a cloud. So you can do that with alcohol in a glass chamber using dry ice. So it's very low tech. And if you put a piece of radioactive material inside, then you'll see the history of the particles through space and time, kind of like the trails behind an airplane. So as the airplane goes through the clouds in the sky, it leaves behind these trails of condensation. And the particles, the radioactive particles coming off of your source material, will leave those same condensation trails. So by its history through space and time, I mean, you can't actually see the particle, but it's kind of like the tail of a comet or those condensation trails behind an airplane. You can't see the particle, but you can see what it leaves behind the moment after it's been there. And to me, this was just remarkable. And in the way that clouds are beautiful, it was beautiful. So I really wanted to make one once I found out it was possible. It was just exciting. Again, just innocent wonder and curiosity. After I did this, in grad school, in my studio at the University of Colorado Boulder, I was thrilled when it worked. I posted videos of the phenomenon on social media, and this ended up really freaking out a lot of people in the art department. I woke up to an email from the building proctor and department chair about doing chemistry and using radioactive materials in the studio, and how they had gotten all these emails from people who didn't know if I was making a bomb or something. And I had to explain myself and assure them that it wasn't dangerous, that nobody was getting exposed to radiation. I was using at first the radioactive material that's in smoke detectors. So fun fact, all of our smoke detectors have americium, a radioactive element. You do not get exposed to radiation from your smoke detectors because the radiation dissipates about an inch away from the source. And it's all very contained. So I assured them this is no more dangerous than your smoke detectors. But all that is to say, I learned that something that I could find simply mesmerizing was also quite terrifying to people. And that got me very interested in the history of the nuclear age, World War II, dropping the bombs on Japan, the Cold War. And then I started to make this shift away from the purely innocent side of curiosity and scientific exploration, and in something more sublime. The sublime, most simply understood, as something that's so beautiful it might kill you, something that's beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon. It's breathtaking, but it'd be terrifying to get too close to that edge. And so all that is to say, when I I lost faith in God and replaced it with curiosity. I think, although I haven't lost faith in inquiry, I've certainly learned about how it's not all fun and games. It does have a dangerous edge, and that there's always trade-offs. So with you asking me about this life-changing event of realizing that I'm wrong, it's helped me not become too blind to the trade-offs of this new sort of religious fixation that I have.
So are the dangers that you're referring to, is that the, like being sort of exposed, or the cognitive dissonance of being wrong, or something like that?
Well, I suppose both. With scientific material specifically, obviously the fear of exposure was looming large in the minds of everyone who freaked out at the art department at CU Boulder. But I think their fear comes from the trauma of the 20th century, of the realization that the pursuit of knowledge could lead us to create something that could annihilate humanity. I think that Susan Sontag put it best when she said, for the first time in human history, we're faced not just with the possibility of individual death, which is certain, but instantaneous incineration and species-wide annihilation with very little warning. So I think that was very traumatizing, the idea that humanity could self-destruct. And I think the person who describes this problem best nowadays is Nick Bostrom. He's a philosopher at Oxford, and he calls it the vulnerable world hypothesis, that we are a very curious species. And he uses the metaphor of the urn of possible inventions, and that in our curiosity, we're pulling these balls out of the urn of possible inventions. And for the most part, we pulled out white balls that have led to incredible improvements in healthcare and standards of living. And we put out some gray balls like nuclear energy, which we can use to make bombs, and the possibility of mutually assured destruction that became apparent during the Cold War. And he wonders if it's possible that there's a black ball inside the urn that we've just been lucky to not pull out yet. And this would be a technology that, by virtue of discovering it, would inevitably lead to the annihilation of the people who discovered it. So he suggests the example of, what if making a nuclear bomb was something you could do with a microwave and other household materials? Just what if it was actually that easy? Or what if bioengineering technology becomes advanced enough that anyone could set up a basement lab and create a virus or something that could wipe out the human race? And then it just takes a single madman, a single person like Batman's Joker, who just wants to watch the world burn. And so I think it's actually a very compelling argument, and I would recommend that people Google Nick Bostrom's vulnerable world hypothesis. He has the working paper available online as a PDF, because it's quite startling. He self-consciously offers Orwellian solutions, and he says that he's using Orwellian terms to describe this, terms like a freedom tag to describe a surveillance device that would be attached to people at all times. So a kind of ironic term that, doesn't sound very free. Something that sounds like it came out of Orwell's 1984, because he wants to make no illusion that this possible solution of what he calls turnkey totalitarianism to safeguard against a vulnerable world, that it is quite terrible. And I find it very compelling, and I think it's the greatest challenge to anyone who wants to make curiosity sacred. That, well, if we keep exploring our curiosity with abandon, then we really might end up being in a situation where curiosity kills the cat. So, again, just to pull this back around to a discussion about how losing your faith in something can make you more open-minded, it certainly prevented me from just blindly loving science to the point that I can't appreciate the criticisms. One of my heroes is Richard Feynman, a physicist who helped invent the bomb in the Manhattan Project. And he compared science to a Buddhist proverb. To every person is given the key to the gate of heaven, the same key opens the gate to hell. And I think that's very true about inquiry. And at the same time, I think that it's in the trade-off, in the cost-benefit analysis, it would be worse to stifle open inquiry than it is to face these existential risks. It's a risk that I'm willing to take, but I understand how it's so scary that you can understand why how people could feel more comfortable with certainty. It's not like uncertainty is without risk.
Right. Well, there's certainly some great names you dropped there, and I would agree that Nick Bostrom's work is really interesting. I don't know if you've heard the podcast that he did with Sam Harris, but it was really fascinating, yes. And he talks about the some of those things you mentioned. I'm fascinated, how one of the things that we really is a focus of ours is professional development of teachers, and most of the teachers that we work with have been through some sort of pedagogy training in pre-service, university, something like that. But lots of our university and college professors and instructors like yourself have not. And what I have become increasingly convinced of is that our K-12 teachers would really benefit from being exposed to and really gaining lots of these inquiry skills. Not that they don't have them, but it's just a different mindset. And in some ways, they've been, programmed or pushed into a corner in ways that school K-12 is in so many ways about answers, and the accountability and the tests that we give kids and the scores that we publish have sort of pushed a different mindset, and it's such a hard thing to make that shift towards more of an inquiry stance. And I'm just fascinated by your ability to do that. I'm assuming, and maybe I'm wrong, that you haven't gone through any pedagogy-specific training.
I have not, and I was actually thinking about this when you invited me on the podcast. I thought, oh no, this person's asking me to go on this podcast about teaching, and no one's ever actually taught me how to talk. I was just kind of thrown in to the classroom, and I don't know if that's peculiar to art schools or universities at large.
No, it's not. I
started teaching in grad school, and I was the instructor of record. I did not start off as a TA, but just as a graduate instructor. And so my approach to pedagogy has been thinking back to my favorite professors and what about being in their classes was so meaningful to me. And I've kind of just learned as I've gone along, including grad school. I've been teaching for 4 years. So, this semester I'm teaching 5 classes, which is a lot. Some semesters I'm only teaching 2. But for the most part, about 3 a semester for 4 years. So I guess I'm relieved that you knew when you asked me that I didn't have any formal pedagogical knowledge.
Yeah, I assumed. And so I guess an interesting question for you, as you have not had that pedagogy training, is if you had to prioritize between these two things, one being content, course content that you're teaching, and the thinking, the ability to think and ask great questions, what would you prioritize first and second, if in fact you would?
I'm not sure if I entirely understand the question, because you kind of have to have the course content to ask the questions around. Right.
So I'm trying to ask it in a way that doesn't provide my answer for it. Yeah. Course content, if you're teaching art, for example, I assume that there are pieces of content that you're trying to teach and then assess that they understand it, whether it's as simple as shading and colors and things like that, on up to something much more sophisticated. But then the the thinking skills, the soft skills, the 21st century skills, enduring skills of creativity, collaboration, those kinds of things, and critical thinking skills being maybe the most relevant here. So I guess maybe instead of prioritizing, how do you see the relationship between those two?
Well, at least within my domain, I feel like the technical skills have to come first. And of course, there's different styles with drawing and painting. But if you're learning how to draw the world from observation well, there is a right and a wrong way to go about it. And it's the kind of situation where you need to learn the rules before you break them and then stylize. So with those entry-level technical classes, I don't think there is quite as much of the soft skills that you talk about. But then when students get to the upper level classes and have hopefully mastered those skills and are using them to express ideas, at least within art, I suppose there would have to be an emphasis on the questioning over the content. Like I mentioned before, the students have a wide range of interests, and I'm not an expert in all of them. So in terms of just imparting knowledge about something like immigration or economics, it's something it's not my place to, I don't have expertise to tell students with a great degree of certainty that they should know this or that about it. But something I can help them do is question their preconceptions. And if they're, like one of my students wanted more border control, and that also became contentious when the class was discussing his work. So the way I handled that was when some of the students were upset that he wanted border control, I assigned an Atlantic cover story that came out a while ago from David Frum that went into the issue in depth. So I'll kind of outsource the knowledge I don't have to a policy wonk or somebody who I consider informative, and then try to lead a Socratic discussion about it. Again, like I mentioned in my essay, my discussions weren't formal Socratic seminars, but probing questions. A student makes an assertion, and I'll follow it up with a question like, well, do you mean this or that? Or are you sure? Have you thought about this? And help them, coach them thinking through what they're saying.
Right. Well, so we're named TeachThought instead of Teach Content for a reason, and I say that sort of tongue-in-cheek, but the relationship between content and thinking is, in our estimation, lots of times misunderstood or misapplied, that especially in maybe more hard content courses like, a math class or even a history class where there's lots of facts, that it tends to be driven by the content, that we want to make sure that we're teaching all this content and that students are understanding it on a test, and that hopefully we can get them to engage in some thinking skills while we're doing that. And we tend to think of it in reverse, or opposite, that we want to teach thinking skills, and kind of as you mentioned in your first answer to the question, is that you have to have some content to think about, right? So it's really in many ways a grist for the mill. I'm thinking about your course, though, being maybe more skill-based than content-based, and maybe I'm wrong on that, or courses. I think you teach more than one, but that there's not necessarily a list of content that they have to remember or those kinds of things. It's really building skills of art and expression and things like that. So it doesn't, the content, I would imagine, doesn't drive the work the same way that it might in a high school algebra class per se.
That's right. They certainly have to take art history classes, and one of the measuring sticks that our students are compared to is their knowledge of art history. Contemporary art can be very self-referential to other contemporary artists and modern artists. So there's an expectation that they have an understanding of the art world and in its history. I don't think art students are required to have a very deep understanding of non-art topics that they might want to discuss in their artwork. And there are some who will get a double major, but it's kind of out of the art department's control, and we're not experts to evaluate if a student's making artwork about some topic, how accurately they're going about that. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I think it is distinct from other fields, and I wonder sometimes if we should maybe be focusing more on the technical skills and keeping it within our area of expertise, because perhaps art schools become ideological breeding grounds, and fashionable opinions can take over in that vacuum of a lack of knowledge outside of the art historical context.
Right. I would suppose, too, that is a good complement to one of my arguments, or maybe more so a mission, is to counteract some of the criticism that progressive education, quote unquote progressive, not as in Democrat or liberal or anything like that, but that progressive education, as opposed to traditional sort of lecture-based didactic, that what is lacking is content understanding, that students come away with, well, that was fun, that was interesting, but not necessarily rich content knowledge. And we really believe that is doing students a disservice. So not leaning into inquiry and curiosity and those things at the expense of knowledge, but in ways to really build rich knowledge, because you're making great connections and you're asking great questions, whether it's about racism or economics or geometry, which may be a little less sexy and controversial than those first two. But, what are the important questions that we should be asking here, and how do we steel man the other side and make sure that we're seeing both sides and not just taking that easy path of this feels good, which gets to that desirability bias and those kinds of things. So, Megan, I'm conscious of your time here, and I appreciate your patience with the technical glitches, and hopefully it's not too much of a difficulty, or hasn't been, for listeners. But where should people find you, if they should find you at all, other than the Quillette places?
Yeah, they're welcome to find me. If they're interested in my artwork, they can go to my personal website, megangafford.com, megangafford.com. And I'm most active on Instagram, as are most other artists. And my handle there is megan.gafford. And believe it or not, I'm trying to become active on Twitter, for all that many people consider it a terrible cesspool and are trying to break their Twitter addictions. I use Twitter in fits and starts, and since I've been publishing more essays, I feel like I ought to use it a bit more, and my handle there is Megan_Gafford.
Okay. You've mentioned a couple books in the article, the Quillette article, one of them, How to Have Impossible Conversations. And, of course, I had James Lindsay on. He's been on twice. You mentioned some other resources, but outside of those, or maybe any of those that you mentioned there, that you might recommend for people listening if they're interested in sort of the mindset that you have sort of developed or written about here?
Well, I talk about Richard Feynman a great deal, not in the Quillette essay, but in Curiosity is Sacred. I think of that essay as a kind of expansion on his ideas. And he was the physicist who works with the Manhattan Project. He has an essay called The Value of Science. So if you Google Richard Feynman, Value of Science, I think it's one of the most meaningful essays I've ever read. In terms of books, I know you've had Jonathan Haidt on your podcast, and his book, The Righteous Mind, I think helps us understand our religious natures, whether that's traditional religion or not. And I did not bring up Steven Pinker, but he's a another academic I admire, and I do discuss his most recent book, Enlightenment Now, in my essay, Curiosity is Sacred. And I want to bring him up at the end because he is often criticized for being too optimistic. And so I guess I want to end by pointing out that the happy ending I had with this class gives some credence to not having a doom and gloom attitude about the world. And I think that Pinker is the most eloquent representation of a more level-headed, not purely optimistic, but a kind of realism that embraces the historical reality that things have gotten better and better. And maybe we shouldn't be too terrified of the sky falling down, including with the situation with viewpoint diversity in the classrooms that I think it's definitely something I'm very concerned about, and I think Pinker is concerned about as well. Haidt started Heterodox Academy, an organization for academics who are concerned about it, that I joined, so it's a huge concern. But keeping the fear in check and not getting too panicky, I think, is important too. So I'd highly recommend Steven Pinker.
Yeah, those are all some great recommendations. One last question before I let you go. Have you received much pushback or hate mail from your Quillette article? Because Quillette can be, at least to some, a fairly polarizing place.
Not at all. Quite the opposite. I have had invitations like yours. I have an invitation from someone at History Colorado here who really liked the article and wants to get coffee and talk about it. So I'll meet that person soon. And the other professor who assigns my classes at CU Denver liked my essay on social media. So, my superiors at work have not seemed upset at all. I've only gotten positive feedback, honestly, and I think that's significant because I do have a very left-leaning art community of friends in both the art and academic side of my life here in Denver, and I have not felt ostracized one bit. Everyone has been wonderful.
Well, good. That's encouraging, and I suppose there is hope after all, right?
I think so.
Yeah. Well, Megan, again, thanks for your patience and for connecting. Really interesting. We'll make sure to link all of those things in the show notes for folks who are listening. If you're on iTunes, you'll have to go to one of the TeachThought.com or WeGrowTeachers.com to find those links, because iTunes doesn't like to publish links, but any other place or most of the other places has them. So, again, thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.